My name is Sister Linda Babineau. I was born Ethelmar Linda, and I was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1941. I was the only surviving child of about 5 who had died in infancy. And basically, when I was going to be enrolled in school, my mother, instead of sending me to the public school in our neighborhood, thought it would please my dad to send me to the French-Canadian Catholic school in Hartford, which was staffed by the Daughters of the Holy Spirit. So I began my schooling in kindergarten with the daughters up to 8th grade, and always felt that my mother had a piece in my vocation because I really wasn't to go there if all had just gone as planned in the neighborhood. I think that even in grammar school, I had that inkling that I would enter religious life. Never considered other orders at that point because the daughters were wonderful. They were my teachers. However, when I got into school, I went to a Catholic school that was run by the Mercy Sisters. I joined, I think like I was a junior in high school, I joined a vocation club. And the priest that was our kind of like our mentor or facilitator would bring us to various congregations, either in Connecticut or Massachusetts, and just to give us a feel, did we feel attracted to this particular group? What were they basically, what was their mission? Was it teaching or nursing or possibly even social work at that time? So that's what I did in my junior and senior year. When it came time for graduation, before that, I had planned and was accepted at St. Joseph's College in Hartford if I didn't enter. But I had this pretty strong feeling that after writing to Sister Rita, Saint Onge, Mother Rita de la Croix at that point, that I really did want to enter. And probably thought that all things being equal, I would be a teacher. And I wanted to be a teacher. So it seemed to fit. And the sisters that I knew, for the most part, I loved, and I liked their who they were, and they were down to earth. They were simple. Some of them were fun, and so I guess like every other girl at age 17 going on 18, I thought, wow, I think I'd like to be like that. Well, my dad was extremely proud, though he always made sure that I knew, even up to like any time, even after perpetual vows, if you ever decide to come home, you will always be most welcome and no questions asked. Talk about having freedom, not to feel guilty or whatever. But he had entered the seminary when he was, I'm trying to remember what age, around maybe 18 or so. And this was in Canada. And he probably stayed a year or two, and then he left. So he had a sense of what it meant for a religious vocation. And he would back up his loving daughter, his beloved daughter, no matter what she chose in life. My mother would have appreciated more that I would get married and give her some grandchildren. But I think with my dad's understanding of things and his sense of, she needs to do what she needs to do. Maybe she'll leave, maybe it's not for her, and that'll be okay too. So she did come around. And I'm sure it was difficult for him too, but, not to have grandchildren. But that was never anything that he spoke to me about, no. Off I went to Putnam. We needed a slip of from our pastor, who was Monsignor Routier at that time, saying that we were a suitable candidate for the novitiate, in good standing with the church, with St. Anne's Church. He had asked me, I need to say this because it strikes me as so hilarious at this point in my life. He said to me, do you know what you're getting yourself into? And he was kind of strict and stern in his ways. And I said, oh, yes, oh, sure. And that is the most hilarious thing. After 50-some years in religious life, I didn't know nada about what I was getting into. But when we're young, we're very idealistic, and I think that's what it's supposed to be, sure. For anything that we choose, there's that idealism. It's going to be wonderful, it's going to be perfect. We were 24 that entered that year. That was a huge group. We had some mistresses that kind of kept us walking the straight and narrow line. We had every day a talk by Sister Rita, preparing us little by little for religious life. And by the time that was for 9 months. Then we became novices, took on the blue habit, and that would be for 1 year for us. And during that time, we studied the rule, we studied the vows, and during those days, we all took notes to make sure that we had everything down that we needed to know. And we tried to be our very best, because I think there was always this little inkling that if we weren't, we could be, quote, thrown out and sent back home. So I think it was, tripping the light fantastic there. I think we wanted to be, and we wanted to be perfect, because the goal seemed to be in those days perfection. So that's what we tried to be, is perfect. 1961, end of the novitiate. I am accepted, and I'm very grateful for that. We work on a little piece that we're going to have with us that is a letter to our God. And in that letter, we speak our heart. I'm not sure we ever showed it to anybody. I don't think we did, not even to the Mistress of Novices. But we folded it up. I think I still have it. And then we had a piece of material like silk, and we somehow tatted or whatever around it. And that was our final, really, until we actually said our vows. That was what was in our hearts and what we were professing to our God from ourselves, giving ourselves to God. After the novitiate, our group basically went to Amherst College, to Diocesan Sisters College. And we were there for 2 years, and during that time we practice taught on our Christmas vacation week and on our Easter vacation week, as I remember it, in Musa. We went into a classroom there with one of our sisters who was a top-notch teacher. And so she would give us, we would do lesson plans. We would come in the next day. We were 3 in my group. And so we would sit in the back while one of us was teaching. She was observing. And then in the evening, before we left, she would give us pointers. You did this very well. You could have improved here. And so we had a taste of teaching. And we were taking courses toward elementary school teaching as well during that time. So we were called juniors. We were in a, quote, juniorate. And much of that time was wonderful. We were out in the country. However, I had a professor that, for English, because already they were looking at us and saying, well, maybe you would be good in math, maybe you'd be good in English, maybe you'd be good in whatever, science. And so I took a senior course that year with Sister Helen Bonin, and yet we lived in the same house as our professors, but quote unquote, we did not speak to our professors, nor did they to us unless we had them in class. And that happened to just be the way the rule was. The only other time they spoke to us or to our mistress of juniors was when we did not read perfectly well in the dining room during meals. And then we would find out about it from the professors. And then because they needed teachers badly, or I was assigned to St. Joseph's Waterbury, which was a Lithuanian parish that we had had as daughters for a good number of years. And that's actually where I began my teaching experience, with summer school for, let's say, the next 5 or so summers, so that I could complete my, my first degree, my bachelor's degree in education. I was in teaching about 20 years, and during that time, I was a principal in Fairfield for 5 years. I also went to Anniston, Alabama for 2 years. We were working with the Edmondite fathers, the daughters and the Edmondite fathers, and our school was an all-black school, I believe, except for one white student. And then we, the white pastor and the white sisters, as well as some lay teachers who were black. One of the things from my experience of teaching in Anniston, Alabama, was being kind of integrated. I had never taught black students. I grew up in a city, though, where I was used to having black people, around me on buses or street corners. I had gone to high school with a few black students in my class. So I had that sense, and I was at ease with it, but not in the sense of being immersed into it. And so at one point, I remember teaching religion to what would be comparable to 4th and 5th graders, and it was Advent time. And I said to the class, well, we're going to, collect some greens and make an Advent wreath. And they looked at me like I had 3 heads. And it dawned on me, their sense of greens is collard greens, not pine greens. And so all I could do is, I guess I just laughed with them and I said, oh, I think this is what you're thinking, and this is what I mean for Advent. And so, it's an experience of a culture, of a subculture that you don't know until you take something for granted. And then you learn the language and you learn some of the customs. And also in the South, there is a difference in their hospitality. You walk up a street and it'd be, how you all doing today? And very, very friendly, very friendly. Where here in the North, we tend to be a bit more conservative and, kind of standoffish a bit. So it was a good experience for me. As happens in community, the community experience was not so good. It was a rough year for me, or 2 years. But the teaching experience was something that I will remember with great fondness, yes. And then the reason I did not stay on for another year or more was that my dad had some difficulties. He had a chordoma, which is a non-malignant growth on the brainstem. And so he was suffering from that and needed surgery. And at that time, I could not see myself being 3,000 miles away from my mother and dad and everything that he was going to go through for the next 3 or 4 years. So I came back to Connecticut. I appreciated teaching in my own alma mater, and that was at St. Anne's, Hartford. So I taught there for 3 years. When I was there, this is how things change within a certain number of years. When I was there, you had to be at least one parent who was French-Canadian background. When I taught there, we had some of that. We had Portuguese students because there was a Portuguese immigration into Hartford. We had Puerto Rican students because there was that immigration coming in. And the first year that I was there, I had 2 black students who were new to the school and had only been in public school. So we kind of had the League of Nations. And for me, I loved it. It was great. And I just loved being back. Going up the stairs, worn down by hundreds of students, me included, and then going back there as a teacher to give back what I had received from my teachers. Yeah, that was good. Well, after I taught, I was on a provincial team of 3 persons, and that was from 1983 to 1986. I was with Sister Connie Charette, and I was with Sister Beatrice Tiru. And Connie and I were assistants at that time. So it was my first mission in leadership. That first year, one of the key things that I remember is that we were getting ready for, I believe, a general chapter. And for the provincial chapter, we had the question, what would be life-giving and what would not be life-giving to you as you move along in religious life, or what is life-giving? And we divided up into 4 groups by age. And I remember that at that particular time, the group that both Connie and I would have been in at that point, was the youngest group. And we decided that our conversations together were so good that we wanted to continue that. It began a group called SAGE. SAGE stands for St. Anne's Group. And that's because we met at St. Anne's. However, soon on, we didn't like the word SAG, so we turned it into St. Anne's Group in Evolution, and that became SAGE. We hoped that we would be wiser and more in tune with one another and companion one another into the future by looking at religious life, the issues of religious life, our particular congregation, or any questions that might come up for study, like for a provincial chapter or an international get-together every 6 years, which is our general chapter. So we spent time together in serious discussion, but there was always laughter there too. And we also spent time getting to know one another and relaxing with one another. And someplace in our not job description, but mission description of this group, we do a great job in balancing all of that and showing the balance that we have in coming together either twice a year or once a year. And it grew into not the youngest group, but anyone in the province who wanted to join us. And we had some fantastic sisters that might have been 20 years older than we were, but were right on in their theology and spirituality and their love for the congregation, wanting to see it grow like we did. One of the key things in the 80s was being for the sisters. The sisters would come to each one of us wherever they would be. We would go to their communities, we would visit, we would see how their mission was, what their mission was, and try to be for them, bringing something of spirituality to our meeting with them in community, and all kinds of problems could come up. It could be the sale of a property that had complications to it because someone had bought the property, didn't think that they were counseled enough about a nearby local small airport that may have been noisy. I mean, there were all kinds of, there was situations of finance that we were responsible for, and what were we going to do as years continued, what needed to be done. So we would discuss that. Personnel issues that came to us, and it came to each one of the three of us. We prepared for provincial chapters. We prepared for general chapters. We prepared for Council of the Congregation groups that met in France every 3 years, kind of between general chapters. And we had government meetings. And so we were often, in those 3 years, there was a chapter, there was at least a government meeting, and probably a CCC. We, as a provincial team, were looking at finances, we're looking sometimes at legal questions, the sale of some properties, getting prepared for international meetings, which we call a general chapter, and also, yes, international meetings that were called the CCC, the Congregational, I can't think of the, actually. Consultative Committee of the Congregation, Consultative Committee of the Congregation. And so we were meeting very often. And sometimes we agreed on issues. Sometimes there were question marks and we disagreed. However, one of the key things that I remember is that we had the sense of upholding one another as a group. And if we made a decision, whether we personally were completely for it or still had maybe some reservations, we stood for one another. That was very important. And I believe that the province saw us that way as well, as working together for their good and working well together. By that point, I had felt that those 3 years in administration, and also my dad being in a nursing home now, which took place during that time, I was also being for my mom in a very different way, in trying to go every week to make sure that everything was set up for her. She was diabetic. She couldn't go out and do shopping. She didn't drive. She was very sickly, and now my dad, who was her caretaker, was at St. Mary Home, which was a horrible thing for me to do. A good thing for him, but not easy for me to do. So it felt sometimes, as our American expression is, a three-ring circus. I was busy doing the provincial team work, but I was also constantly being pulled to make sure that my mother was safe and my mother was okay. So I chose to ask that after that 3-year period, it not be renewed for another 3 years. And so a new team emerged, and then I actually was granted that permission by the general counsel. So in '86, I went to a community in New Britain, and we had an apartment there. We, the daughters that were there, had an apartment, and I began pastoral work at St. Elizabeth's Health Care Center. First, going to one of their homes part-time in Waterbury, and also helping. I was doing different part-time jobs at that point, also working with a nurse practitioner in Hartford, being like the secretary, doing intake and helping patients that were coming in to her. And so I even traveled to Bridgeport one day a week to another Roncalli nursing home, because they were all connected. And finally, after about a year and a half, did have a position only in one place, and that was in East Hartford at St. Elizabeth's Health Center. I was doing pastoral care, which was like being a chaplain there. And one of the things that I did, tried to do as much as I could each day, was to visit individual patients there, whether they were Catholic or not, but there were a good number of Catholic patients. I also made sure that for whatever the special feast days of the church were, whether it was Christmas, December 8th, Easter, Advent cycle, the Lenten cycle, that we came together as a group and we celebrated that, and I would prepare with others those celebrations. Made sure that there were some volunteers that worked with me, and they often would come and give out communion. We also had a priest that came in for Mass once a week. We were very, very fortunate for that. So to set up the liturgy and to make sure there were volunteers for that day, and also worked with the recreation person who was Jewish, however, felt very strongly that she would talk to the nurses, and the patients had better be ready for when Mass started or the rosary started or whatever else started, because she felt strongly that the persons there, especially the Catholics, really wanted to go to these events, and she did not want to deprive them. And so I had a wonderful connection with her and her team of people at St. Elizabeth's. But also worked with the staff in many ways. I tried to be for the dying, especially during their last days. If there was an emergency, I would go to the hospital to see those that were hospitalized, and I would try to be there for a wake or a funeral when one of our residents died, to be for the families, and to be with the families when they came in to visit as well. I live at Bethany Community in Hartford. I am retired, but I volunteer presently in Hartford. Through our parish is one way that I volunteer. And so I visit, again, the elderly. One is in her apartment, but has a fairly hard time getting around. One is at one is at St. Mary Home, and a new person now is at Hughes Nursing Home in West Hartford. And so I visit them as a pastoral visit, but through the parish of Holy Trinity Parish. And one of the women that I visited in Simsbury, which is a bit far, but she was a longtime parishioner, died in the last 3 months. So again, tried to be present to her. When she was in the hospital, I was present to her son. And for the funeral, I was present to her only daughter and son and family as the final saying goodbye. It's important for me to be for the family of the persons that I'm visiting, if that's possible, and it was in this particular circumstance, to let the son know that his mother was respected and remembered by a parish, that she wasn't forgotten, that her husband, who was Lithuanian, was not forgotten either, that people at the parish valued her being a parishioner, even after she could no longer, attend Mass. And that I did go to see her, that I visited her regularly, so that it wasn't only he, because his sister lived in Germany. So he was the one family member. The grandchildren live in Germany. So he was basically the one that went to visit his mom every day in the morning before he went to work. But he could count on not only the good care there at the nursing home, but that somebody else was also visiting and praying with her and holding her dear. I also teach, which is wonderful because I teach at Jubilee House. I'm a tutor, this time of adults, and it is to teach them English as a second language. And so I volunteer there at Jubilee House, which is sponsored by the Sisters of St. Joseph, twice a week in the mornings. And I have these wonderful adult students who love to learn. What a perfect setup for a teacher. And so I love it, as well as going to see the elderly and being with them, being present to them. I was at our provincial house in Putnam, and I began my ministry there in 2005 with Sister Paulette Garapi. Sister Paulette was in charge of the Provincial House Sisters community, and I was her assistant during those 6 years. And our first year, I think, was trial by fire. When we came together, there were a number of sisters that were very ill or who were dying. And so we started our mandate in July, and by September, one of our sisters had died. In December, one of our other sisters had died in January. There might have been 7 or 8 sisters within that first year. And each one takes a piece of your heart in a way, because you see your sisters at the provincial house having known this person and gotten to share life with this person and love them, and you are there for them when they're sick. You are with them when they go to the hospital, and we tried to do that most every time that one of the sisters went to Day Kimball Hospital in Putnam, and we were a good number. At one point, I believe we were 57 at that time when we first came together. So it was, again, for our provincial team community, working with the staff, having them understand that we were a community. We were not just a healthcare center. We were a home. This was our home, a very big home, needless to say, but our home, and that we wanted it to be for our sisters to have that feel that it was home, that it was their community, and not just that we were a state facility, for critical care, that there was more to us than that. And so we worked. I would go once a week to the meetings for patient care so that I could, and Sister Paulette also could keep up with what was happening physically or mentally to our sisters, what was happening for how they were going to be cared for so that we knew what was in place, and how things would change for them. Sometimes it could change quickly, other times it could change very gradually over months or a year or so. So there was, that was some of the work that we were doing. One of the things that touched me was the resilience and the courage of our sisters. And I saw that day in and day out, especially when there was chronic issues of a heart condition where people were weakened, of not being able to breathe too easily, respiratory situations, of those that suffered through diabetes that affected their whole bodies, those that were fighting or trying to control having arthritis. And so it could have been any part of their body being affected. It could have been their knees, their feet, their ankles, their backs. And some of them, I would say, probably never complained. And sometimes they'd talk to me about something and they'd say, I don't mean to complain. And I would say to them, I think what you're doing is sharing with me. I don't hear any complaints. And it is kind of nice to share with somebody, what's going on with you. So I learned courage and compassion for them. But that probably stemmed back to when I did pastoral care with elderly people at St. Elizabeth's Health Center. But these were my sisters, so there's a different, it's a different population. It's my family, and so it makes that much more of a difference. I also learned to appreciate what all the staff were doing in each of their particular ministries. They might not call it that, but we would call it that. Whether it was nursing, nurses' aides, RNs, LPNs, whether it was being in charge of dietary, of meals, of house cleaning. I'm sure I'm going to forget something right now, but all of those different departments and being with them, talking to them, being with the person that was their administrator downstairs. I think you just, I don't know, I learned.
Some of us look to you, Linda, as the poet of our province, the beloved poet.
Yes.
What is that gift that you have? How do you come to it?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind when I consider that I have written quite a few poems as a daughter, never did as a child or as a teenager or in the novitiate, but these later years, maybe 20 or 30 years, how do I come by it? I think it's a sense of trying to go deeper into a situation. It could be somebody's 50th birthday, and what would I like to say about that? And how will I find words rather succinctly, but with a certain warmth, perhaps humor, that kind of hits the nail on the head, that kind of takes this experience and puts it into something that words can paint, I guess is what I would say. I'm not an artist with paints. That's somebody else's creativity. But with words, and I think I've loved words since I was in grammar school even. And that got to grow a bit in high school, and then got to grow a bit at Amherst College with some of my courses there in English. And so it just feels natural. I think it's the Holy Spirit that is working through my wit and my very humble and simple mind that loves words. I think that's basically it. It's like the Holy Spirit, saying, okay, so yeah, you're starting to write this and that. And that's usually what I do. Just ideas, just thoughts, just whatever. And then I somehow put it together, and it seems to come out as a whole for me. And for a few other people, like my friends and community members.
Could you talk a little bit about how your concepts of God and spirituality, when you look at yourself as a 18-year-old and now, what has evolved? What has changed, or what's the same? Or
when I entered, our church was very set, I would say, in its ways. Vatican II had not taken place, and I grew up with the Baltimore Catechism, I believe, at least in grammar school, and in high school, I'm trying to remember. I think we were a little bit changing a bit on that, but there might have been another kind of Baltimore Catechism that we had as teenagers. But everything, even in the novitiate, you would keep the rule, and the rule would keep you. So the rule was extremely important. There was two things, but even then, we never had the letter of the law without having the spirit behind it. I mean, that didn't happen. But I would say that in the novitiate, it was more the actions, the things you were going to do where you followed the rule. And you were not to deviate from that. And as I brought up before, the more perfect that you could do that you could love the rule and follow those tenets, the better religious you would be. And then our profession group, got to the junior rate. So now we're talking profession in 1961, being at Amherst in 62, 63, 64, thereabouts. And Vatican II is in preparation. And I believe it was 62 to 65. So by the time that I was leaving the junior rate, ready to go into teaching, we already had, and I'll forget the name of the priest, but he was an Edmundite priest that came to talk to us a summer at the provincial house, about some of the changes. We were just starting to have a little sense of that. And as we continued our summer studies at Amherst, there wasn't a whole lot of maybe change, but there was some. We were not learning, like we did with Father Gwenver, certain theological tenets that maybe did not touch our lives so quickly. They were things that we learned. And as I continued my education beyond that, and I went to LaSalle College in Philadelphia for one summer, and I then went to Boston College for a degree, master's degree in religious education. Then Vatican II was more than seeping in to my college courses. And then that's when there was a whole different sense of theology, Christology, scripture. And at that time, I kind of dare to say this, I hope it won't offend anybody, but I think we as sisters who had that education at the time in whatever way we did, came out of those courses probably better prepared and welcoming of Vatican II and its changes for religious life and church life than some of the priests who seem to have stayed into this mode of, well, if we have to, we will. So changes of liturgy weren't as difficult for me as it might have been for, let's say, a priest in our parish at that time, because we were more opened. Okay, let's see what else. Spirituality-wise, we would have in the novitiate, we would have readings. And one of the things I remember, because I would tend to be a nervous person trying to remember, was that every so often the reading would begin, somebody was reading for the group, we were mending, knitting, doing whatever, hand-wise. And our mistress of novices would ring the bell and say, Sister so-and-so, what idea struck you? And all the way through the reading, you were trying to catch on to some idea, I was, so that I would have something to share when that question would come to me. So whether I got a whole lot out of the readings, I'm not sure. But it was it was too staid. It was too in a box, so to speak. And later on, you were able to read spiritual books by different authors, sometimes different sisters who had a profound, like Sister Joan Chittister, for example, and what she was saying about religious life. Those that had been not only just an author, not that that's not good enough, but they had been the person in charge of their congregations. They had gone through extensive study, theological study. And so, and then also our congregation as we continued. I don't want to give the impression we stayed where we were in the novitiate. No, we didn't. Our congregation continued to move in the direction of meetings and ideas for the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, to which we belonged. And so that was an education in itself, especially if you were in leadership. We would go to our local chapters of that, and then we would go, at least different ones of us, would go to the national convention. And there, you had extremely beautiful and meaningful liturgies, and you had very serious discussions on religious life, on justice issues, on who you wanted to be in mission, in the world of today, whatever date that was, whether it was in the 70s or 80s or 90s or the new millennium. And where were things moving? In the late 70s, more and more there was a new piece, I think, of spirituality that was coming into being, and that was for religious and lay people as well to grow through what we call spiritual direction. Spiritual direction is partnering with another person. It might be a religious, it could be of another congregation, it could be a priest or a brother or a lay person, in which you come together on a regular basis. That can be different for different people. It could be about once a month. It could be every 3 months, depending on what your situation is. And you speak about how God is in your life and in your life experiences. And I think for me, that has been one key experiences that right up to the present moment have helped me to grow. Growing to know myself better, and of course, having having hard spots that you discuss and that you face in spiritual direction, having those humorous spots where you can laugh at something about God and yourself, more at yourself, and that brings you as well to, who is God for me now? Maybe it's a little different than a year ago, or possibly I've been through some life experiences like grief, losing a mom and dad, not feeling at ease in maybe a community situation, thinking that maybe you failed in a particular year of your teaching because it didn't go well that year for you and you struggled, and to beautiful experiences of a retreat, a yearly retreat, where you've come in contact, and not only that, through your daily living also, nature, other people, sisters in community, your friends, that somehow have made you a better perfect person. Not perfect, but a better person, one who is growing. And that goes back and forth. It ebbs and flows and spirals, and sometimes you're kind of down, sometimes you're up. But it's an experience that if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be in the place I am today. One of my hopes for the future is to live out my mission as a daughter of the Holy Spirit to the best of my ability, not perfect, to the best of my ability until my dying moments. Already, I've been through some physical situations that have not been easy. And some of that, I expect, I know, is going to follow me into the future. So the future is, I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen. I really don't know how many more years I have. But I do want to be growing spiritually. I do want to be with my sisters in our hopes together for the future, for justice in our world, for a more compassionate world, and to be with my older sisters, because that's what's going to happen. It's happening more and more, that sisters are dying, our sisters that have been friends to us for many years. We are becoming the older generation, but we're not quite there yet. But we're definitely on our way. And I want to be able to tutor if that's what God has planned for me. I want to be able to be part of a parish because I love my parish that I'm in, and I feel very much part of it, not only to those I visit, but just to other parishioners. And I want to grow in our sense of community, not only in our province, but internationally. I doubt if I'll ever go to another part of our international group. I've been to France. I'm grateful for that. I've been to different meetings there. I've been to associate meetings there, to congregational meetings, and I'm deeply appreciative. But I won't go to Africa. I won't go to South America because physically I won't be able to do that. But I'm hoping to meet this year, when we have the Council of the Congregation here in our province, some of our African sisters, I know but a few, and some of our South American sisters, I know but a few, so that internationally there's a sense of bonding. And I think that happens it has already happened, but it will continue to happen. And it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds and to see how we unfold in our diminishment as a province, because that's very definitely I'm concerned about and I know is going to happen. So it's like I still believe that we can be surprised by the Spirit. I still believe that. Not necessarily the way we might think we're going to be surprised by the Spirit, but simply surprised by the Spirit. And I think the stronger we are in our bonding together, that we are a witness to our world, in whatever shape that's going to take. Not the shape I thought it would when I was newly professed. But we did have a statement. I would like to just go back to this for a minute. When we made our vows, and Connie, you may be able to help me here because I can't remember it exactly. The French expression was carte blanche. It was as if you were opening a book and your first page and all the pages after, there was nothing written on them. You and your God were going to do the writing as you continued on in life, in ministry. And I've done a lot of years of that, but I'm at another page and it's empty. And there's some more pages that I think are going to be after that. And my life will be writing in those pages. And I trust in a tender God of justice and peace to get me through.